It was the 8th of August, 117 AD, on a small boat anchored off the coast of a town called in a remote corner of Cilicia, and the Emperor of Rome was dying, partially paralyzed by a stroke. His body swollen with the fluid retention the ancient physicians called dropsy, unable to write his own name, and the single most consequential decision of the next 2 decades of Roman history: who would inherit an empire stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf, was about to be settled, not by the dying man himself, but by the people standing closest to his bed. His wife held the pen. What happened before the news of the emperor's death was even allowed to reach Rome would shape the rest of the 2nd century. And historians are still, 1900 years later, genuinely unable to say with confidence whether what happened in that room was a dying man's final wish or a carefully managed deception staged by the people who needed a particular outcome and had every opportunity to produce it. This is the story of Hadrian, the man who would rule the most powerful empire on earth for 21 years, who built a wall across the width of an island most Romans considered the literal edge of the world, who fell in love with a teenage boy and, when that boy drowned, declared him a god, and who spent the final 2 years of his own life trying, with escalating desperation, to solve a problem that being the most powerful man alive could not actually fix, finding someone he trusted enough to hand it all to. If you are new here, welcome, settle in. This channel exists to find the stories that got simplified along the way and tell them properly. The research behind tonight goes deep into the actual ancient sources, Cassius Dio, and the considerably less reliable but endlessly entertaining Historia Augusta. And there are details here that most popular histories skip past because they complicate the simple image of Hadrian the Builder. The wall, the Pantheon, the peaceful philosopher emperor. By the end, you will understand not just what Hadrian built, but the specific, considerably more anxious and considerably more ruthless man who built it. If you have been here before, you know the pace. Let the world go quiet. We are going to Rome, and then to a frontier so far north that the men stationed there called it the edge of everything. Here is the first thing you need to know about Hadrian. He was not, by birth, the kind of man anyone expected to rule an empire. His family came from a town called Italica in southern Spain, a Roman colony so far removed from the city of Rome itself that his own relatives, by some accounts, spoke Latin with a provincial accent that the sophisticated aristocracy back in the capital found faintly ridiculous. His family was wealthy, comfortably established within the Roman senatorial class, but it was a wealth built on Spanish olive groves and provincial administration, not on any deep ancestral connection to the city that actually ran the empire. What changed everything was a cousin, Trajan, also from a career soldier whose own rise through the Roman military and political hierarchy would eventually make him emperor. And when Hadrian's father died in 86 AD, when the boy was only 10 years old, it was Trajan, along with a Roman equestrian named Publius Acilius Atienus, who became his joint guardian, a decision that placed Hadrian, from the very beginning of his adolescence, directly inside the orbit of a man who would, within little more than a decade, hold absolute power over the entire Roman world. It did not go smoothly at first. Trajan, attempting to launch the teenage Hadrian into a respectable military career, sent him to serve as a tribune in Upper Germany, and Hadrian, by several ancient accounts, showed considerably more enthusiasm for hunting and the comfortable pleasures available to a wealthy young man with connections than for actual military discipline. Trajan, reportedly irritated by his ward's lack of seriousness, recalled him to Rome specifically to keep a closer eye on him, an inauspicious beginning for a relationship that would eventually determine the succession of the entire Roman Empire. Hadrian's prospects improved considerably once Trajan himself became emperor in 98 AD, and improved further still through a marriage arranged, by most accounts, not by Trajan himself, but by Trajan's wife, Plotina, a woman whose quiet, persistent influence over the imperial household would prove again and again across the following 2 decades to be one of the genuinely decisive forces in Hadrian's entire rise to power. Around the year 100, Hadrian married Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grandniece, a marriage that bound him formally into the imperial family and positioned him, however distantly, within range of the eventual succession. It is worth being honest about what this marriage actually was, because popular retellings sometimes soften it considerably. The ancient sources describe the relationship between Hadrian and Sabina almost uniformly as cold, even openly hostile, lasting, in formal terms, for nearly 40 years and producing no children whatsoever, a detail that, combined with everything else we know about Hadrian's personal life, has led generations of historians to read the marriage as exactly what it appears to have been on its face: a purely dynastic arrangement between 2 people who were never expected by anyone involved in arranging it to actually want each other's company. Trajan himself, according to several ancient accounts, was reportedly less than enthusiastic about the match, which raises an interesting question that the surviving sources never quite resolve. If the emperor himself had reservations about tying his own grandniece to this particular young man, why did the marriage happen anyway? The most plausible answer, and the one most modern historians have settled on, is Plotina again, working quietly behind the scenes to secure her own family's continued influence and position by binding a promising young relative of her husband's directly into the dynasty, regardless of whether the emperor's own personal enthusiasm for the specific choice ever fully caught up with hers. By 117 AD, Trajan had spent years expanding the empire eastward, fighting an ambitious and ultimately catastrophically overextended war against the Parthian Empire, conquering territory in Armenia and Mesopotamia that Rome had never successfully held before and would, within a generation, prove almost completely unable to hold afterward either. By this point, an experienced and well-regarded officer was serving as governor of Syria, commanding a substantial portion of the legions involved in that eastern campaign. Trajan's health, never fully recovering from the strain of years of active campaigning at an advancing age, collapsed during the return journey toward Rome. He suffered what ancient sources describe as a stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to write, and was put ashore at the small coastal town of Selinus when his condition deteriorated too severely to continue the sea voyage. Accompanied by his wife Plotina, his niece Matidia, who happened to be Hadrian's own mother-in-law, and Atianas, the same man who had been Hadrian's joint guardian decades earlier and now served as Praetorian prefect, commanding the only military force actually present in the room with the dying emperor. Here is where the historical record becomes genuinely, frustratingly uncertain, and where the considerable mass of subsequent scholarship has produced theories rather than settled answers. Trajan died on the 8th of August, but the news of his death was not made public for 3 full days. On the 9th of August, a letter was announced in Antioch declaring that Trajan had adopted Hadrian as his son and heir, and only 2 days after that, on the 11th, was Trajan's actual death finally revealed to the wider world. The ancient historian Cassius Dio, writing decades later but drawing on an account from his own father, who had served as governor of the same province where these events unfolded, records the suspicion directly and without much diplomatic softening. The adoption letter that reached Rome and the Senate had not been signed by Trajan himself, who, paralyzed and unable to hold a pen, could not have signed anything at all. It bore instead the signature of his wife Plotina. Dio goes further, repeating a rumor circulating at the time that someone had been smuggled into the dying emperor's chamber specifically to imitate his voice, allowing Plotina to claim, with a witness apparently able to confirm it, that Trajan had personally and verbally affirmed the adoption before his death, even though by every medical account of his condition, this would have been exceptionally difficult for a man who had already lost the ability to write. There is one further, genuinely eerie detail that several ancient sources preserve. A young manservant of Trajan's, named Phedemus, died very shortly after the emperor himself, under circumstances vague enough that some ancient writers speculated he had been killed, or had perhaps killed himself, specifically to avoid being questioned about exactly what he had witnessed in the dying emperor's chamber. During those 3 crucial days, it is the kind of detail that on its own proves nothing conclusively, but that, sitting alongside everything else, adds another layer of unease to an already deeply suspicious sequence of events. Modern historians, weighing all of this evidence against itself, have generally settled into a position that splits the difference. Most now believe Trajan probably did, at some point before his final incapacitation, genuinely intend for Hadrian to succeed him. The marriage Plotina had arranged years earlier, Hadrian's demonstrated competence as a governor and military commander, and the simple practical reality that Hadrian was the closest plausible candidate, physically present in the eastern provinces with troops already prepared to support him, all point toward a genuine, if informal, expectation of succession that had been building for years. But the specific, formal mechanics of the actual adoption, the document, the signature, the convenient 3-day delay, look considerably more like Plotina and Attianus managing the paperwork of an outcome everyone involved had already decided on, rather than the spontaneous, witnessed deathbed wish that the official version presented to the Senate. Whatever the precise truth, the Eastern legions, the only military force that actually mattered in the immediate aftermath, acclaimed Hadrian emperor without waiting for the Senate's input at all. And the Senate, presented with a fait accompli, backed by an army Hadrian already commanded, had little practical choice but to confirm a succession it had played no actual role in deciding. Hadrian, perhaps aware of exactly how irregular this looked, wrote to the Senate, apologizing for the unseemly haste of his own acclamation, explaining that the troops had simply refused to allow the state to exist for even a moment without a recognized emperor. A carefully worded piece of damage control that did not entirely succeed in smoothing over what happened next. Within weeks of his accession, while Hadrian himself remained in the east securing his new position, 4 prominent senators of consular rank, all of them men who had been close to Trajan and who, in different ways, might have represented plausible alternative claims to power or simply continuing threats to a still uncertain new regime, were executed on the order, officially, of the Praetorian prefect, acting by Hadrian's own later insistence, entirely on his own initiative and without the new emperor's knowledge or authorization. Almost nobody believed this at the time, and almost nobody believes it now. The Senate, predictably and with good reason, held Hadrian responsible for the killings, regardless of how carefully he attempted to distance himself from the actual order. And the relationship between Hadrian and the Senate, an institution whose formal cooperation he needed for the rest of his 21-year reign, never fully recovered from this single, brutal opening act. Hadrian eventually allowed Selinus to retire from his post, a resolution that, rather than clarifying responsibility, only deepened the ambiguity. If Selinus had genuinely acted alone and inappropriately, why was he rewarded with an honorable retirement rather than punished? And if he had simply followed Hadrian's own orders, the convenient retirement looks considerably more like a quiet payoff for taking the blame. It is worth sitting with this opening chapter for a moment, because it establishes a pattern that would recur with remarkable consistency across Hadrian's entire reign. A man who achieved supreme power through circumstances genuinely too ambiguous to fully verify, who responded to the resulting insecurity with swift, brutal action against anyone who might represent a threat, and who then worked, often quite effectively, to publicly distance himself from the violence his own position had required. A pattern of careful deniability that the historian writing his biography a century later, working from sources considerably more hostile than the flattering image of the wise builder emperor that survives in popular memory, clearly found impossible to take entirely at face value. One of Hadrian's very first major policy decisions as emperor reveals exactly how differently he intended to govern compared to the cousin who had raised him. Trajan's entire later reign had been built around aggressive territorial expansion, the conquest of Dacia, and the ambitious, costly push into Parthian territory that had occupied his final years. Hadrian, almost immediately upon securing his own position, abandoned the eastern conquests entirely, withdrawing Roman forces back across the Euphrates and restoring the more limited client kingdom arrangements that had existed before Trajan's war began. This decision, defensible on purely practical military grounds given how genuinely difficult the newly conquered eastern territories had proven to hold and supply, was nonetheless deeply unpopular among large segments of the Roman public and the Senate, who had spent years celebrating Trajan's conquests as evidence of Rome's continuing, unstoppable destiny for expansion. Hadrian was, in effect, telling Rome that the empire's most celebrated recent achievement had been a mistake, a message that, regardless of its strategic merit, did not endear him to a political class already deeply suspicious of how he had come to power in the first place. Hadrian's underlying philosophy of governance, which would define the rest of his reign, represented a genuine and deliberate break from the expansionist logic that had driven Roman foreign policy for centuries. Rather than continuing to push the empire's boundaries outward, he committed instead to consolidating, fortifying, and administering the territory Rome already held, a strategic vision that prioritized stable, defensible frontiers over the prestige and plunder of continued conquest, a position that some of his contemporaries read as caution or even a kind of failure of nerve, and that many modern historians have come to regard as genuinely far-sighted statesmanship, recognizing the practical limits of an empire that had, by this point, already stretched itself close to the actual edge of what Roman logistics and administration could sustainably manage. It was in service of this exact philosophy that Hadrian embarked on what would become one of the defining features of his entire reign: sustained, extensive personal travel across nearly every corner of the empire. By some calculations, spending as much as 12 of his 21 years as emperor away from Rome itself, inspecting frontiers, reviewing troops, commissioning buildings, and personally observing the actual conditions of provinces that most emperors before him had governed entirely through distant correspondence and the reports of officials they never personally met. This was, in its own way, a genuinely radical approach to imperial governance, an emperor who insisted on seeing the empire's actual edges with his own eyes, who reportedly marched on foot alongside his own soldiers for stretches of 20 miles or more at a time, sharing their rations and their discipline in a manner that, whatever its political calculation, built him a level of personal loyalty among the army that contrasted sharply with the considerably colder relationship he maintained with the senatorial aristocracy back in Rome. It was during one of these extensive tours, in 122 AD, that Hadrian arrived in the province of Britannia, at the northernmost, most exposed edge of the entire Roman Empire, and made the decision that would, more than any other single act of his reign, attach his name permanently to the physical landscape itself. Roman Britain had been, for decades, a genuinely difficult province to hold securely the northern reaches of the island. Populated by tribes the Romans had never successfully conquered or fully pacified, represented a persistent military drain, and there are indications, including a fragmentary funerary inscription suggesting significant Roman casualties shortly before Hadrian's arrival, that the frontier had recently suffered some kind of serious military setback, a defeat or uprising serious enough to require the emperor's own direct personal attention. Hadrian's solution was not to push further north and attempt yet another conquest of the unconquerable Caledonian tribes. In keeping with his broader philosophy of consolidation rather than expansion, instead, he ordered the construction of a continuous fortified wall, stretching coast to coast across the narrowest width of the island, roughly 80 Roman miles from the mouth of the Tyne in the east to the Salway Firth in the west, a wall that would come to bear his name for the rest of recorded history. The scale of what Hadrian actually ordered built deserves to be understood in real physical terms, because the popular image of a simple defensive wall considerably understates the genuine complexity of what Roman military engineers produced across roughly 6 years of continuous construction. Beginning around 122 AD and largely completed by 128. The wall itself, where built in stone, stood somewhere between 15 and 20 feet high and roughly 10 Roman feet thick, though the specifications shifted at various points during construction. In some sections, later builders reduced the width considerably, apparently in the interest of finishing the project more quickly, a detail that suggests even an emperor's signature infrastructure project was not immune to the kind of budget and schedule pressure that affects construction work in every era. The western third of the wall was initially built not in stone at all, but in cut turf, stacked and compressed, before later being rebuilt in more durable stone construction decades after Hadrian's own death, running the entire length of the structure, spaced at intervals of almost exactly 1 Roman mile, were small fortified gateways called mile, each capable of housing a garrison of several dozen soldiers, and between every pair of mile castles stood 2 additional observation towers called turrets, creating a continuous chain of watchpoints, roughly every third of a mile across the entire 73-mile length of the frontier, a level of constant, granular surveillance that, considered alongside the larger forts built directly into the wall's structure at slightly wider intervals, represented one of the most thoroughly garrisoned and continuously monitored borders the ancient world had ever attempted to construct. The labor itself came from 3 full Roman legions, totaling somewhere in the range of 15,000 trained soldiers, supplemented by units of the Roman fleet, an enormous diversion of military manpower away from active campaigning and toward sustained, organized construction work. Once completed and fully, the wall and its associated forts housed something close to 10,000 troops along its entire length, drawn not from the legions that had built it, but from auxiliary regiments of infantry and cavalry recruited from across the provinces. Historians have argued for generations, and continue to argue today, about what the wall's actual primary purpose was. The most intuitive assumption that it functioned as a straightforward defensive barrier designed to repel armed invasion from the Caledonian tribes to the north fits some of the engineering evidence, but not all of it. Several features, including doors on the ground floor of the watchtowers that would have offered little genuine security against a determined assault, suggest that pure military defense against large-scale invasion may not have been the structure's only, or even its primary, function. An alternative and increasingly influential interpretation holds that the wall functioned, at least, as much as a mechanism for controlling and monitoring movement and trade across the frontier, as it did as a fighting barrier, a kind of enormous fortified customs post stretching across the entire width of an island, allowing Roman authorities to track tax and selectively permit crossing between the empire and the territories beyond it, rather than attempting to seal the border completely against all passage. The structure positioned south of the wall, called the vallum, a wide ditch flanked by earthen mounds, running roughly parallel to the wall itself for much of its length, appears, by most modern archaeological assessment, to have served not a military purpose at all, but as a boundary marker, deliberately keeping the civilian population on the Roman side of the frontier at a careful distance from the military zone immediately surrounding the wall itself. Whatever its precise original purpose, the wall represented, in the most literal and permanent way available to any Roman emperor, exactly the philosophy of consolidation over conquest that defined Hadrian's entire approach to governing the empire. A physical, monumental statement carved directly into the landscape of the empire's most exposed frontier, that Rome's destiny no longer lay in continuous outward expansion, but in clearly marking, defending, and administering the territory it had already claimed. The biographer who wrote about Hadrian 2 centuries later, working from sources considerably closer to the actual events than anything available today, described him simply as the first emperor to build a wall 80 miles long from sea to sea, specifically to separate the Romans from the barbarians, a description that, regardless of which modern scholarly interpretation of the wall's precise tactical function ultimately proves correct, captures something genuinely true about the larger statement Hadrian was making, not with words, but with 73 miles of stone and turf, stretched across the entire width of an island most Romans back in the capital would never personally see. It is worth taking a moment to register the sheer geographic breadth of Hadrian's building program, because focusing only on the wall and the Pantheon, however justified by their fame, considerably understates just how completely he reshaped the physical fabric of the empire he ruled. In Rome itself, beyond the Pantheon, he commissioned the Temple of Venus and Roma, the largest temple the city had ever seen, deliberately positioned on the Velian hill between the Forum and the Colosseum. Dedicated to 2 goddesses representing both romantic love and the eternal city itself, and completed only after his own death by Antoninus Pius, he restored countless older temples, shrines, and aqueducts across the city that had fallen into disrepair, and built a new bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Aelius, specifically to connect the city to his own planned mausoleum, a structure that survives today, considerably altered, as the Ponte Santa, still carrying pedestrians across the same river 19 centuries later. Beyond Italy, the scale becomes genuinely difficult to summarize briefly. In Egypt, he restored the Temple of Serapis at Alexandria and dedicated a statue to the sacred Apis bull. In Asia Minor, he funded the completion of a temple to Zeus at Cyzicus that earlier Hellenistic kings had begun centuries before and never finished, and promoted several cities, Pergamon, Smyrna, Ephesus, and Sardis among them, as regional centers of imperial religious worship. In Argos, in Greece, he funded an enormously ambitious engineering project specifically to solve a water shortage, so severe and so long-standing that the city's thirst had been mentioned disapprovingly in Homer's epic poetry, composed nearly 1,000 years earlier. An aqueduct system tunneling water in from Mount Parnes that took years of sustained construction to complete. He restored the constitution of Athens at the city's own request, added an entirely new civic tribe named directly after himself, and was granted, in return for this sustained patronage, the rare honor of Athenian citizenship and even the city's chief magistracy, the archonship, in 112 years before he ever became emperor at all. In North Africa, he extended a fortified frontier system known as the Fossum Africae, performing, in essentially desert terrain, the same basic strategic function his British Wall performed across an entirely different landscape. And in Palmyra, the wealthy desert trading city in Syria, He granted the honorific civic name Hadriana, Palmyra, and personally rewarded local merchants who had helped protect trade routes running between Rome and Parthia. It is worth noting because it speaks to a genuine and consistent character trait rather than simple vanity, that the Historia Augusta specifically records he inscribed his own name on almost none of these countless public buildings, the single exception being the temple he built to honor his deified predecessor Trajan, a restraint that, set against everything else this narration has covered about Hadrian's genuine personal vanity. His beard, his architectural rivalry with his elaborate deification of Antinous suggests a man capable of drawing a careful, deliberate line between building monuments to serve the empire's stability and building monuments simply to serve his own immediate, visible glory, a distinction his adoptive predecessor, with his towering, self-commemorating column still standing in Rome today, had drawn rather less carefully himself. It is worth pausing before turning to the relationship that would come to define the most personally consequential chapter of Hadrian's life, on what kind of man he actually was in temperament and in physical presentation, because the popular image of the dignified wall builder tends to flatten a personality. The ancient sources describe as genuinely restless, contradictory, and considerably more idiosyncratic than the marble busts suggest. He was, from an early age, so devoted to Greek language, literature, and culture that he earned, as a boy, the nickname Little Greek, a label that started, by most accounts, as a mild mockery of his enthusiasm, and that he wore, as an adult, almost as a badge of honor. Greece, though it had been a conquered Roman province for nearly 3 centuries by the time Hadrian came to power, still carried, in the Roman imagination, an inherited prestige as the source of the philosophy, art, and rhetoric that educated Romans considered the foundation of genuine culture, and Hadrian, more completely than any emperor before him, built large portions of his own public identity around an explicit, sustained embrace of that Greek inheritance. He was the first Roman emperor in history to wear a beard, a detail that seems almost trivial on its surface, but that represented a genuine and immediately recognizable visual break with centuries of Roman imperial portraiture. Every emperor before him, going back to Augustus's own deliberately youthful, clean-shaven image, had presented himself clean-shaven. In the conventional Roman style, Hadrian's beard, modeled on the styles favored by Greek philosophers, was an unmistakable visual statement, embedded directly into his own coinage and statuary, and seen by every person across the empire who ever handled Roman currency, that this particular emperor identified himself, at least in part, with the intellectual culture of Greece rather than the purely martial, clean-shaven Roman tradition his predecessors had cultivated. He spent extended periods of his reign in Athens itself, funding an enormous program of construction there that rivaled anything he commissioned in Rome, completing the temple of Olympian Zeus, a building project so vast that previous attempts across several centuries had never managed to finish it, building a new library, a new aqueduct, and an entirely new quarter of the city that came to be known, with a directness that left no ambiguity about whose vision had produced it, as Hadrianopolis, the city of Hadrian, distinct from the older city the Athenians themselves still inhabited. He was, by several accounts, a man of genuine and wide-ranging intellectual curiosity, interested in architecture, poetry, philosophy, astrology, and medicine, and confident enough in his own learning that he reportedly engaged in direct public debate with established philosophers and rhetoricians of his own era, a habit that did not always endear him to the professional scholars, whose entire careers had been built on precisely the kind of expertise an emperor was now publicly contesting. The Historia Augusta records, with evident relish for the kind of anecdote that makes a powerful man look petty, an episode involving a philosopher named Favorinus, who, after losing an argument with the emperor on a point of grammar, purportedly told his friends afterward that he saw no shame in yielding to a man who commanded 30 legions, a joke that captures, with real precision, the specific and uncomfortable dynamic of intellectual debate with a man who, regardless of the actual merits of his argument, held the power of life and death over everyone he was debating. He wrote poetry himself in both Latin and Greek, composed an autobiography specifically intended by most modern scholarly assessment to manage and correct the public record on the more controversial episodes of his own reign, the 4 executed consuls chief among them, and was deeply interested in astrology and divination. The Historia Augusta records that he had been told of his eventual rise to the imperial throne years in advance by a great-uncle who was himself a skilled astrologer, a detail that, whether literally accurate or simply the kind of retrospective prophecy ancient biographers loved attaching to powerful men after the fact, fits comfortably alongside everything else we know about Hadrian's genuine, sustained fascination with the mystical and the predictive. He was initiated during one of his extended stays in Greece into the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most secretive and prestigious religious rites in the entire ancient Mediterranean world, an honor that few Roman emperors before him had ever sought or received, and that connects directly to the broader pattern of an emperor who understood, with real political sophistication, that aligning himself publicly with the deepest, most prestigious roots of Greek religious and cultural tradition served his own image and his own authority just as effectively as any military victory might have. It was around 123 AD, most likely somewhere in the province of Bithynia, in what is now northwestern Turkey, the same general region Constantine's own mother Helena would come from nearly 2 centuries later. Asterisk, that Hadrian, by this point approaching 50 years old, encountered a boy named Antinous, who would have been somewhere around 12 or 13 at the time, born in a small town with no particular distinction beyond what this single encounter would eventually grant it. Almost nothing reliable survives about Antinos's life before this meeting. No family details, no record of his upbringing, nothing beyond the simple fact that he possessed, by every surviving account and by the overwhelming visual evidence of more than 2,000 statues that would eventually be carved in his likeness across the empire, an extraordinary physical beauty, the specific qualities the ancient world prized: full lips, a low brow, thick curling hair, and an expression several modern art historians have described as faintly melancholic even in his earliest surviving portraits. Antinous became, from this point forward, a constant presence at Hadrian's side, traveling with the emperor's retinue through Italy, through Greece, through the provinces of Judea and Syria, and eventually to Egypt. The ancient sources are notably restrained on the precise nature of the relationship in its early years. Roman culture, unlike many modern frameworks for understanding sexuality, did not draw the same sharp lines around the gender of a person's partners that later Western tradition would. What it did police carefully was the specific power dynamic involved, a relationship between an older, powerful man and a younger male companion fit within categories Roman elite culture had long found unremarkable, provided the dynamic followed certain expected social conventions. There is no surviving evidence. Despite Antinous' extraordinarily privileged position at the very center of imperial power for roughly 7 years, that he ever attempted to use his influence over Hadrian for any personal or political advantage. No recorded interventions in policy, no faction built around his favor, no enrichment of his own family. A genuinely unusual restraint for anyone holding this kind of intimate access to the most powerful man in the world, and one that several modern historians have read as suggesting the relationship, whatever else it was, carried a genuine emotional weight for both men that went beyond simple transactional convenience. In the autumn of 130 AD, traveling with Hadrian's imperial party on a tour of Egypt, Antinous drowned in the Nile River. He was not yet 20 years old. What actually happened remains, 1900 years later, genuinely unresolved. The ancient sources themselves could not agree. Even at the time, Cassius Dio records that Hadrian, in his own autobiography, claimed simply that Antinous fell into the river and drowned, an accident. But Dio immediately adds that the more widely believed explanation held something considerably stranger, that Antinous had deliberately sacrificed himself, drowning voluntarily in response to some kind of prophecy or omen, specifically in order to save Hadrian's own life. A piece of ancient Egyptian religious practice, the deliberate sacrifice of a beloved companion to avert disaster threatening a ruler, that several contemporary observers apparently found a plausible explanation for what had happened on the riverbank. Other theories, both ancient and modern, range from simple accident. Drowning was, after all, a genuinely common cause of death along the Nile, to murder, possibly connected to court intrigue or jealousy, to suicide driven by some personal despair the sources never specify, to the specific possibility raised by some modern historians examining the timeline that Antinous' death may have been connected to a serious and mysterious illness Hadrian himself had been suffering from for the previous several years, an illness ancient doctors had been entirely unable to diagnose or treat, raising the possibility that whatever happened on the riverbank was tied, in some way the sources never make explicit, to a desperate hope that the young man's death might somehow restore the emperor's failing health. What is not in dispute is how Hadrian responded. He grieved, by every ancient account, with an intensity and a duration that genuinely startled his contemporaries, even allowing for the considerable license ancient writers took in describing the emotional displays of powerful men. And he did something that no Roman emperor had ever done for anyone outside his own direct imperial bloodline. He declared Antinous a god. This was not a small or merely sentimental gesture. Deification in the Roman world was an enormously significant religious and political act, typically reserved, and even then only through formal Senate approval. 4 deceased emperors and members of the imperial family whose divine status served the explicit political function of legitimizing the dynasty that followed them. Antinous held no official position whatsoever. He was not a citizen of any particular distinction. He had no blood connection to the imperial family, and the Roman Senate never formally approved his deification at all. Hadrian simply proceeded as though it had happened anyway, an exercise of purely personal authority over Rome's religious life that several contemporaries found genuinely shocking. He founded an entirely new city, and on the Nile, near the site where the young man had drowned, built temples to him across the empire, and commissioned a staggering volume of statuary. More surviving images of Antinous exist today than of any other figure from the ancient world, apart from Augustus and Hadrian himself. A genuinely remarkable statistic, given that Antinous held no official position, achieved no public accomplishment, and is remembered, in the most basic and literal sense, almost entirely because one particular emperor loved him and could not let the world forget that he had. The cult of Antinous, whatever the Senate's formal silence on the matter, proved genuinely popular, particularly in the eastern provinces, spreading and persisting for generations after Hadrian's own death, before the Christian emperors of the following 2 centuries eventually suppressed it along with the rest of Rome's traditional pagan religious practice, and Antinous himself, across the centuries that followed, became something his own brief, sparsely documented life could never have anticipated, a recurring symbol in Western art and literature, invoked by writers, including Oscar Wilde, as one of history's most visible and most enduring emblems of love between men, an afterlife built entirely on the specific intensity of one powerful, grieving man's refusal to let an ordinary death be the end of the story. It is worth recovering one further dimension of Hadrian's personal life before turning to the final reflection, because it connects his genuine physical courage, his relationship with Antinous, and, in a small but genuinely striking way, back to Constantine, the very emperor this channel covered in its previous episode. Hadrian was, by every ancient account, an enthusiastic and remarkably committed hunter, a passion that began in his boyhood in Spain and continued without interruption for the rest of his life, regardless of whatever other duties his office demanded. Cassius Dio records that he broke his own collarbone while hunting and very nearly lost the use of one leg in a separate accident. Injuries he apparently regarded as an acceptable cost of a pastime he had no intention of abandoning, and he founded an entire city in the province of Mysia, naming it Hadrianothore, literally Hadrian's hunting grounds, specifically to commemorate one particularly successful bear hunt, a detail that captures, with real economy, exactly how completely hunting had become woven into his own sense of identity as emperor. The most famous specific hunting episode involved Antinous directly in 130 AD in the Libyan desert. Hadrian and his young companion took part in a lion hunt that became, almost immediately, the subject of celebratory verse. An Alexandrian poet named Pancrates composed a poem specifically commemorating the event, and the surviving tradition holds that during the hunt, Hadrian personally intervened to save Antinos's life when the lion turned dangerous. An episode commemorated afterward on imperial coinage showing the emperor on horseback in pursuit of the animal, and later carved into a large relief sculpture, a tondo, depicting the hunt with Antinous clearly visible among the figures. This single image, more than almost any surviving text, captures the specific, physical, outdoor intimacy of their relationship. Two men hunting dangerous animals together in the desert, one risking his own safety to protect the other. Here is the detail that connects this story directly back to Constantine. The relief sculpture depicting that exact lion hunt, along with several other Hadrianic hunting scenes, was not lost to history. It was physically removed from a now vanished Hadrianic monument and reused nearly 2 centuries later as decoration on the Arch of Constantine itself, the very triumphal monument this channel discussed in its previous episode. The one whose carefully vague inscription crediting victory to an unnamed divinity became such important evidence for understanding what actually happened, or did not happen, at the Milvian Bridge. The faces in these recycled reliefs were sanded down and reworked to resemble Constantine and his own contemporaries. Hadrian's features replaced with Constantine's, even as the original hunting scene, Antinous included, remained otherwise untouched beneath the new emperor's face. It is a small, genuinely remarkable piece of physical continuity across 200 years of Roman history, a monument celebrating one emperor's Christian victory, physically built, in part, from recycled stone, celebrating an earlier emperor's hunting trip with the young man he loved and would later declare a god. 2 completely different stories. 2 completely different religious worlds, sharing the same physical marble, a reminder that the Roman Empire these 4 episodes have covered was never really for separate, disconnected stories at all, but one continuous, overlapping civilization, repeatedly cutting up and repurposing its own past, quite literally carving new faces onto old stone, to make whatever story the present moment required, whether that story was about conquest, or restraint, or grief, or God. It is essential to include, in any honest account of Hadrian's reign, the single most devastating episode of organized violence that occurred under his rule, because the popular image of the cultured, Phil-Hellenic builder-emperor has, over centuries of retelling, allowed this specific catastrophe to recede almost entirely from common memory, despite its scale and its consequences rivaling anything in the bloodiest chapters of Roman history. Around 130 AD, during the same general period as his fateful journey to Egypt with Hadrian announced plans to rebuild Jerusalem, still bearing the scars of its destruction during the first Jewish revolt against Rome more than 60 years earlier. As a thoroughly Roman colony, to be named Aelia, combining his own family name with a dedication to Jupiter Capitolinus, the chief god of the traditional Roman state religion, on the site of the ruined Jewish temple itself. Hadrian planned a new temple dedicated to Jupiter, a decision that historians still debate the precise sequencing of, alongside what may have been an additional ban on circumcision, a practice central to Jewish religious identity that Hadrian's administration appears to have viewed through the lens of a broader, empire-wide policy against ritual genital mutilation rather than any specifically targeted religious persecution. Though the practical effect on the Jewish population of Judea was identical, regardless of the policy's original intent. The response was the Bar Kokhba revolt, beginning in 132 AD and led by a charismatic and militarily capable figure named Simon Bar Kokhba, whom at least one of the leading rabbinical authorities of the era, Akiva ben Joseph, publicly hailed as the long-awaited Messiah, a religious endorsement that transformed what might otherwise have been simply another provincial uprising into something considerably closer to a full-scale war of national and religious liberation. The rebels, in the revolt's early phases, achieved a level of success that genuinely startled Roman authorities, capturing dozens of fortified strongholds and, by some estimates, close to 1,000 villages and towns, including Jerusalem itself, and possibly destroying an entire Roman legion in the process. Hadrian's response was to dispatch one of his most capable and ruthless generals, Sextus Julius Severus, the governor of Britain, bringing with him tens of thousands of additional troops and adopting a deliberate scorched earth strategy, systematically leveling villages and outposts, starving and burning rebels out of the extensive underground tunnel networks they had constructed specifically to evade open battle with superior Roman forces. By 135 AD, after roughly 3 years of sustained warfare, the revolt was finally and completely crushed. Bar Kokhba himself killed at the rebel stronghold of Bether. The casualty figures, recorded by the ancient historian Cassius Dio, and treated by modern historians with the same appropriate caution applied to all ancient battlefield statistics, place Jewish deaths somewhere in the range of 580,000 people, not including the additional, uncounted numbers who died afterward from the famine and disease that inevitably followed warfare conducted on this scale, alongside substantial Roman casualties as well, by some assessments heavy enough that Hadrian, in his official report to the Senate announcing the victory, deliberately omitted the customary formal greeting confirming that he and his army remained in good health, a quiet but unmistakable acknowledgement of just how costly the supposed triumph had actually been, and declined the traditional triumphal procession through Rome that a victory of this magnitude would ordinarily have earned. The aftermath was, in the most literal sense, available to Roman administrative power, an attempt at total cultural erasure. The province itself was renamed Syria, deliberately removing any official reference to Judea at all. Jerusalem was rebuilt as the thoroughly pagan city of Aliyah, with Jews formally barred from entering it at all, permitted, in later, somewhat softened practice, only a single day each year to mourn at the site of their lost capital. Jewish religious practice itself, the study of Torah, the observance of the Sabbath, the ordination of rabbis, was banned outright across the empire, and prominent religious leaders, Akiva ben Joseph among them, were executed, becoming, in the centuries of Jewish religious memory that followed, revered martyrs whose deaths under Hadrian's specific persecution are still commemorated in Jewish liturgy and practice today. It is worth stating plainly what this episode actually represents within the larger arc of Hadrian's reign. The same emperor remembered by posterity chiefly for his wall, his architecture, and his grief over a drowned young man, also presided over what many historians now consider one of the most catastrophic and most consequential acts of state violence against a specific religious an ethnic population in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean world. An event whose direct legal and demographic consequences, the suppression of Jewish life in Judea, the beginning of what later history would call the Jewish diaspora's most decisive phase, and whose specific administrative renaming of the province Palestina would, through an extraordinarily long chain of subsequent linguistic and political history, eventually give the modern world the name Palestine itself, a piece of nomenclature still actively, urgently contested 1900 years after the emperor who first imposed it, an inheritance from Hadrian's reign considerably more consequential and considerably less comfortable to discuss than any wall or any temple. It is worth turning now to the achievement most people who know anything at all about Hadrian actually associate with him first. Not the wall, but a building in Rome itself that remains, 1900 years after its completion, one of the most architecturally significant structures ever built, and that almost uniquely among major Roman monuments, has survived essentially intact in continuous use for the entire span of those 19 centuries. The Pantheon that stands in Rome today is not the original building of that name. The first Pantheon had been commissioned by Augustus's own great friend and general Marcus Agrippa, and after that structure burned, a second version, built under the Emperor Domitian, was destroyed by a lightning strike around 110 AD. The building Hadrian commissioned, constructed primarily between roughly 113 and 128 AD, was an essentially complete reconstruction, though Hadrian, in a gesture of genuine historical humility that several modern historians find genuinely striking given everything else we know about his ego, retained Agrippa's original dedicatory inscription on the new building's facade, ensuring that visitors reading the entrance even today see a name from a century earlier rather than Hadrian's own. The dome itself remains, even by modern engineering standards, a genuinely extraordinary achievement, a perfect hemisphere of unreinforced concrete, the largest of its kind ever successfully built before the modern era. Its interior surface divided into recessed square coffers arranged in receding rings, a design choice that served a real structural purpose, removing enormous quantities of mass and weight from the dome's overall construction without sacrificing the strength required to keep nearly 2,000 years of gravity from bringing the entire structure down. And at the very top, instead of any kind of capstone, a completely open circular skylight nearly 30 feet across, called the oculus, that functions, somewhat counterintuitively, as a compression ring, locking the surrounding structure of the dome into place by directing the forces of the entire weight above it downward and outward through the walls, while simultaneously creating the building's single most famous and most visually striking feature, a perfect circle of open sky and a moving column of direct sunlight. Historians genuinely do not know, with full confidence, exactly who designed this building. Ancient sources do not settle the question definitively, and the considerable scholarly debate that has resulted connects directly to one of the more genuinely dramatic personal rivalries of Hadrian's entire reign. Apollodorus of Damascus had been, under Trajan, the most celebrated architect and military engineer in the entire Roman world, responsible for Trajan's Forum, Trajan's towering commemorative column, and a bridge across the Danube River that remained the longest in the world, for well over 1,000 years after its completion. And there is a story recorded by Cassius Dio that captures, in a single remembered exchange, exactly the kind of tension that existed between Hadrian's genuine architectural ambitions and the professional pride of the era's most accomplished working architect. According to Dio's account, Hadrian, while still a young man and not yet emperor, had offered Apollodorus unsolicited advice during the planning of Trajan's Forum, and the architect, apparently unimpressed and entirely unconcerned about the social consequences of insulting a member of the imperial family, purportedly dismissed him outright, telling him to go away and draw his pumpkins, since he understood nothing about the subject. A humiliation, Hadrian, by every indication available to historians studying the relationship's later trajectory, never forgot. Years later, as emperor, Hadrian sent Apollodorus his own personal designs for a planned temple of Venus and Roma, apparently hoping for the architect's professional approval. With what reads as a genuinely reckless lack of self-preservation, given who he was now critiquing, pointed out specific, serious flaws in the design. The statues planned for the temple's interior were proportioned far too large for the height of the chambers meant to house them. So large, Apollodorus reportedly noted that if the goddesses themselves ever wished to stand and leave the temple, they would strike their heads on the ceiling, attempting to do so. Cassius Dio records that this episode, layered on top of the earlier humiliation over the pumpkins, led directly to Apollodorus's banishment, and eventually, by several ancient accounts, his execution on Hadrian's orders. Modern historians treat the specific claim of execution with some appropriate skepticism, since the surviving evidence is thin and largely dependent on a single hostile tradition. But the broader shape of the story, an emperor with genuine architectural talent and genuine architectural insecurity, who could not tolerate professional criticism from the one man in the empire whose technical judgment actually exceeded his own, fits with disturbing consistency into everything else this narration has already established about how Hadrian handled people who threatened his sense of his own authority. Whether that threat came from a rival heir, a conquered religious minority, or, in this specific and almost absurdly petty case, an architect with the professional confidence to point out a flawed ceiling height. Hadrian's final and, by most assessments, most personally revealing architectural project was his own villa at Tivoli, outside Rome, an enormous complex he began constructing during the final years of his reign, designed specifically to recreate, in physical, walkable form, the sites and structures he had encountered across his decades of extensive travel. Reproductions and deliberate evocations of Egyptian, Greek, and other provincial architecture, arranged across the villa's sprawling grounds so that the aging, increasingly ill emperor, no longer able to undertake the kind of extensive travel that had defined the middle decades of his reign, could nonetheless walk within a single afternoon through carefully reconstructed echoes of the entire empire he had once crossed in person. A final, melancholy act of architectural autobiography from a man who, by this point in his life, was already beginning the considerably more difficult work of figuring out who, exactly, he could trust to inherit everything he had built. It is worth including, before this narration turns toward its final reflection, one further dimension of Hadrian's legal legacy that genuinely complicates any simple verdict on the man. His reforms to the legal treatment of slaves across the empire, reforms that, while never challenging the basic institution of slavery itself, which essentially no one in the ancient Roman world, however otherwise enlightened, seriously questioned, nonetheless represented a meaningful tightening of the protections owed to enslaved people under Roman law. He prohibited masters from killing their own slaves outright, requiring instead that any slave accused of a serious offense be formally sentenced by an actual judge rather than simply executed at a master's private discretion. A change that, however modest it sounds today, removed a power that Roman masters had held essentially unquestioned for centuries. He abolished the ergastula, the private prisons individual slave owners maintained on their own estates, facilities that had also, disturbingly, sometimes been used to illegally detain freeborn men who had been kidnapped, and he forbade the sale of slaves to gladiatorial trainers or brothel keepers without specific legal justification, removing a master's previously unrestricted power to simply sell a human being into the most brutal and most dangerous occupations available in Roman society. He also placed real limits on an existing and genuinely horrifying legal custom, the rule that if a slave owner was murdered, every single slave who had been in the house at the time, regardless of any actual evidence of involvement, could be tortured and executed collectively. Hadrian narrowed this practice specifically to those slaves who could reasonably be shown to have had some actual knowledge of the crime. It is worth being honest about the limits of this reform as well. Hadrian, like nearly every Roman of his era, accepted slavery itself as a natural and entirely legitimate feature of the social order. When a crowd in Rome once demanded that he free a popular and beloved slave charioteer, he reportedly refused, explaining simply that he had no legal right to free a slave who belonged to someone else. A small but genuinely telling anecdote. An emperor capable of reforming the brutal edges of an institution while never once questioning its fundamental legitimacy. The same emperor who softened the legal penalties facing enslaved people also enforced strict social separation by class and by sex in public baths and theaters, and insisted that senators and knights wear the traditional toga in public. A man simultaneously a genuine reformer and a committed traditionalist, depending on which specific corner of Roman social life one happened to be examining. There is one further episode worth including here, because it shows Hadrian's own personal response to violence directed at himself. Rather than violence, he was legislating against while walking among trees at the city of Tarraco in Spain. A slave belonging to his own host suddenly rushed at him with a sword. Hadrian, rather than panicking, simply seized the man himself and handed him over to the attendants, who came running. And when it was established that the man was suffering from some kind of madness, Hadrian ordered him handed over to physicians for treatment rather than execution. The biographer recording the episode specifically notes that the emperor himself remained, throughout the entire incident, in no way agitated, a small, genuinely revealing moment of personal composure under a kind of direct physical threat that would have unsettled almost anyone. Consistent with everything else this narration has shown about a man capable of remarkable calm in physical danger and remarkable ruthlessness in political calculation. often within the very same year of his own life. There is a single surviving document from Hadrian's reign that deserves particular attention, because it represents something genuinely unique in the entire surviving record of the Roman Empire. The only speech by a Roman emperor to his own soldiers that survives, in any form, from the ancient world in the summer of 128 AD. During one of his extensive provincial tours, Hadrian traveled to Numidia, in what is now Algeria, to personally inspect the training and discipline of the Roman army stationed there, and after watching the soldiers of the 3rd Legion and several auxiliary units perform a series of demanding training exercises, he addressed them directly, praising specific units by name and offering pointed technical criticism of maneuvers that had fallen short of his expectations. The soldiers themselves, evidently proud of the emperor's personal attention, had his words carved permanently into stone pillars on the parade ground at Lambaesis, where archaeologists eventually rediscovered fragments of the inscription centuries later. The surviving text is remarkably specific and remarkably technical, addressing a unit of cavalry. Hadrian reportedly told the soldiers that they had done everything according to the manual, that they had filled the training ground with their wheeling maneuvers, that they had thrown their spears competently despite using weapons that were short and stiff, and that several among them had thrown with genuine skill. This is not the language of distant, ceremonial, imperial praise. It is the language of a commander who had actually watched the exercises closely enough to comment on the specific quality of individual spear throws and the particular difficulty of the equipment being used. A level of granular, hands-on attention to military detail that no other surviving Roman source attributes to any other emperor with this much specificity. This single inscription captures, more vividly than almost any other surviving piece of evidence, exactly the kind of Emperor Hadrian actually was when he was away from the political theater of Rome and the Senate that resented him. By the account of the biographer who wrote about him generations later, he trained and disciplined his soldiers personally, going bareheaded through German snow and scorching Egyptian sun alike, sharing their hardship rather than simply commanding it from a comfortable distance. And the methods he personally introduced were still being followed by the Roman army, by this biographer's own account, a full century after Hadrian's death. A legacy of military reform considerably less famous than his wall, but arguably just as consequential to the actual functioning of the empire. He spent over a decade traveling to personally inspect. It is worth connecting this specific habit back to the wall itself, because the two achievements are, in a genuine sense, the same underlying philosophy expressed in two different forms. An emperor convinced that an empire's actual strength lay not in the glory of fresh conquest, but in the unglamorous, continuous discipline of maintaining what already existed. Properly trained soldiers, properly built fortifications, properly inspected frontiers. This was not the kind of statesmanship that produced triumphal arches or epic poetry. It produced something considerably quieter and, in the long run, considerably more durable. An army whose training methods outlasted him by a century, and a frontier wall whose stones, in long, unbroken stretches, still stand exactly where his engineers placed them 1900 years later, in a country that did not exist yet when he ordered them laid. By 136 AD, Hadrian's health troubled for years by the same mysterious, undiagnosable illness that some ancient sources connect to the period surrounding Antinos's death, had deteriorated to the point that he began, by his own later admission, contemplating suicide, and with no biological children of his own. The question of who would inherit the entire Roman Empire became, for the final 2 years of his life, the single most urgent and most genuinely difficult problem he had ever faced. His first serious consideration appears to have been his own brother-in-law, the senator Lucius Julius Ursus Servianus, an elderly but well-respected figure, and, looking even further ahead, Servianus's own grandson, a young man named Pedanius Fuscus Salinator, but Hadrian, for reasons the ancient sources do not fully explain, ultimately rejected this option, choosing instead, in 130, to adopt a different man entirely, Lucius, a consul known, by several accounts, for an extravagant and pleasure-seeking lifestyle that made him, on paper, a genuinely surprising choice for an emperor who had spent much of his own reign cultivating an image of disciplined, philosophical seriousness. Servianus, who had apparently harbored his own long-standing hopes that the succession might eventually pass to his grandson, if not to himself, protested this decision, and Hadrian's response was immediate and brutal. Both Servianus, by this point an old man who had served Rome faithfully for decades, and his grandson Pedanius were put to death on suspicion, never fully substantiated in the surviving record, of plotting some kind of resistance, or even an outright coup, in response to being passed over. It is worth pausing on this specific episode because it represents, in miniature, the entire arc of Hadrian's relationship with power across his whole reign, beginning with the 4 executed consuls in the chaotic opening weeks of his accession and ending 2 decades later, with an elderly brother-in-law and a young grandson killed for the crime of having once hoped for an inheritance that was never formally promised to them. The same pattern, repeated at both ends of a 21-year reign, swift, preemptive violence against anyone who might represent even a theoretical threat to whatever succession arrangement Hadrian had currently settled on, the adoption of Lucius Cianis Commodus, who took the name Lucius Aelius Caesar upon being formally designated heir, did not produce the stable succession Hadrian had hoped for. Lucius suffered from poor health, by most accounts, likely tuberculosis, and was dispatched almost immediately to serve as governor of Pannonia, a posting that may have been intended to give him genuine administrative experience before eventually assuming supreme power, but that instead simply removed him from Rome during what would prove to be the final months of his life. Lucius died on the very first day of January, 138, having never actually succeeded to the throne he had been so carefully positioned to inherit. Hadrian, by this point, genuinely dying himself and running out of both time and viable candidates, made his final and, as it turned out, his most historically consequential decision in February of 138. He adopted Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a highly respected senator who had served capably as one of Hadrian's own provincial administrators. But he attached to this adoption a condition considerably more complicated and considerably more far-sighted than any simple, single succession. Antoninus, who would eventually rule under the name Antoninus Pius, was required as a condition of his own adoption. to simultaneously adopt 2 additional young men as his own heirs. Lucius Cianius Commodus's young son, who would eventually rule as Lucius Verus, and a promising teenager named Marcus Annius Verus, the grandson of an influential senator who had been one of Hadrian's own close friends, a boy who would, decades later, become one of the most celebrated philosopher-emperors in the entire history of Rome. Ruling under the name Marcus Aurelius, this arrangement, a single adoption that simultaneously secured an immediate, experienced successor while also locking in a planned succession to full generations into the future, represents one of the most genuinely sophisticated pieces of dynastic engineering in the entire history of the Roman Empire. Hadrian, denied a biological heir of his own, and watching his own carefully chosen candidates die before they could inherit anything, nonetheless managed, in the final months of his life, to construct a succession plan stable enough to govern Rome successfully for the following half-century. Through Antoninus Pius's own long and genuinely peaceful reign, and into the celebrated era of Marcus Aurelius that later historians would eventually remember as the high point of the entire Pax Romana. It is worth noting because it complicates the tidy, far-sighted picture this arrangement otherwise suggests, that Antoninus himself, almost immediately after becoming emperor, quietly rearranged several of the specific marriage commitments Hadrian had originally built into the succession plan, annulling the planned betrothal between young Marcus Aurelius and Lucius's sister, in order to instead betroth Marcus to his own daughter, Faustina, a reminder that even the most carefully engineered dynastic architecture remained, in practice, subject to revision by whoever happened to actually be holding power once its original architect was no longer alive to enforce it. It is worth returning to Sabina, Hadrian's wife of nearly 40 years, because her own story, mentioned only briefly at the start of tonight's narration, deserves to be drawn together properly. In the same way, this channel has tried to recover the women standing beside every emperor it has covered so far. Women, the official record reduces to a single sentence about marriage and succession, while the actual texture of their lives disappears almost entirely. Sabina had been raised following her own father's early death, in the household of her grandmother, under the direct care and supervision of Trajan and Platina themselves, the same imperial couple who would later arrange her marriage, which meant that by the time she actually married Hadrian in her late teens, she had already spent years immersed in exactly the kind of court politics and dynastic calculation that her own marriage would simply formalize. She was not a passive figure handed unknowingly into a difficult match. She had grown up watching this specific machinery operate at close range her entire life. The marriage itself, as already discussed, was cold from a remarkably early stage, and there is a specific episode from roughly 119 AD, recorded in the Historia Augusta, that gives this coldness an unusually vivid, almost scandalous shape. Hadrian abruptly dismissed 2 of his closest and most trusted officials, Septicius Clarus, his Praetorian prefect, and Suetonius Tranquillus, the historian, who would go on to write the very biographies of earlier emperors that this entire channel has drawn on repeatedly, serving at the time as Hadrian's own imperial secretary. The official reason given was that both men had behaved toward the empress Sabina with more familiarity than the strict etiquette of the imperial court allowed. What this familiarity actually involved, the sources never specify with any real precision. Modern historians have generally read it as a euphemism for some kind of inappropriate romantic or sexual closeness, real or merely suspected, between the empress and one or both of these men, rather than literally just relaxed conversational manners, and the dismissal of two such senior and capable officials over what reads, even in its vague surviving description, as a matter of court gossip rather than any genuine threat to the state, suggests an emperor reacting to something he found personally rather than politically intolerable. There is a detail preserved alongside this episode that deserves particular attention, because it is one of the very few moments in the entire surviving record where Sabina's own voice, rather than simply Hadrian's actions toward her, comes through with any real clarity. By one ancient account, when Hadrian, in the aftermath of this scandal, purportedly complained about her difficult and irritable temperament, remarking that he would have divorced her already if he were merely a private citizen rather than an emperor bound by the political necessity of the marriage. Sabina is said to have responded that she had taken her own deliberate steps to ensure she would never become pregnant by him, specifically so that she would not risk bringing into the world another man capable of harming humanity, the way she evidently believed her own husband already had. It is, if accurately preserved, one of the single most cutting and most genuinely revealing remarks attributed to any woman in the entire surviving record of the Roman imperial court, a wife married for political convenience to a man who showed every sign of preferring the company of a teenage boy to her own, expressing not simply personal unhappiness but something closer to a considered moral judgment on her husband's fitness to have ever held the power he held at all. Sabina was eventually granted the title Augusta in 128, a formal honor that several modern historians, examining the specific timing and the careful staging involved, believe was deliberately withheld for the first decade of Hadrian's reign and then granted in a manner calculated to heighten the political theater of Hadrian's own simultaneous acceptance of the honorary title Pater Patri, Father of the Country, the empress's elevation arranged, in other words, less as recognition of Sabina herself than as a useful piece of stagecraft supporting her husband's own carefully managed public image. She died sometime around 136 or 137 AD, shortly before Hadrian's own final illness overtook him. The precise cause is not recorded, and after her death, Hadrian, despite the genuine coldness that had defined their entire marriage, requested and secured her formal deification from the Senate, granting her the posthumous title Diva Augusta, an honor that appears, on its surface, to contradict everything else we know about the actual emotional temperature of their relationship. But that makes considerably more sense once understood as simply one more example of Hadrian's consistent, lifelong instinct for managing the formal, public record of his own reign, regardless of what the genuinely private reality underneath it had actually been. A wife he had never loved, deified by his own request. Into a goddess he had also never loved, because the formal honor served the image of a stable, successful imperial household considerably better than the truth ever could have. It is worth returning before the final closing reflection to the relationship between Hadrian and Trajan itself, because the surviving sources suggest something considerably more psychologically complicated than the simple guardian and ward dynamic this narration described at the outset. Several ancient accounts suggest that Hadrian, while still a young man working to establish himself within Trajan's court, deliberately cultivated relationships with the same young male companions Trajan himself was known to favor, a strategy, if accurately reported, aimed at gaining influence over Trajan's own decisions and affections through proximity to the people Trajan personally cared about, rather than through formal political channels alone. This detail, if true, suggests a young Hadrian who understood, far earlier in his life than the Antinous relationship alone would indicate, exactly how thoroughly personal affection and political advancement intertwined at the very top of Roman power. It also recontextualizes, in a genuinely useful way, everything this narration has already covered about Hadrian's own later relationship with Antinous, a man who had spent his formative years inside a court where an emperor's personal attachments to younger male companions were openly understood when he later became visibly devoted to Antinous himself, doing anything his own mentor and predecessor had not already modeled for him at close range. The genuine intensity of Hadrian's grief and the unprecedented scale of his response to Antinous's death may have been considerably more personally felt than political calculation alone could explain. But the basic shape of the relationship itself, an older, powerful man and a younger male companion, was one Hadrian had watched function at the absolute summit of Roman power since his own adolescence. It is this same psychological complexity, finally, that makes Hadrian such a genuinely difficult figure to render into the kind of single, clean verdict that popular history often prefers for its emperors. He was simultaneously the calculating teenager who may have curried favor through Trajan's own favorites, the brutal new ruler who executed 4 senators in his opening weeks, and an old brother-in-law and a grandson near the very end, the architect who could not tolerate professional criticism from a rival more talented than himself, and the grieving lover who built an entire city and a new religious cult around the memory of a drowned boy, the disciplined commander who personally inspected cavalry maneuvers in the African desert, and the dying, frightened man who composed 5 lines of genuinely moving poetry about his own departing soul. None of these versions of him cancels out any of the others. They simply describe, in their full and uncomfortable totality, the actual, considerably more complicated human being who happened to spend 21 years governing the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Hadrian's final months were, by every surviving account, genuinely difficult. His illness, whatever its precise nature, had progressed to the point of constant, severe suffering. Cassius Dio records that nosebleeds he had suffered from for years grew distinctly more frequent and more severe, and that he reached a point of such consistent physical decline that he could reasonably be described, in Dio's own phrase, as dying day by day, rather than facing any single, identifiable final crisis. His repeated attempts to end his own life, by several accounts, were prevented only through the determined intervention of the attendants and physicians around him. He retired, finally, to a villa at Baiae, on the Bay of Naples, a resort town favored for centuries by wealthy Romans seeking relief in its therapeutic hot springs, leaving the practical business of governing to the heir he had so carefully arranged. And there, on the 10th of July, 138 AD, Hadrian died, most likely of heart failure, having lived 62 years, 5 months, and 17 days, and reigned for 20 years and 11 months. Shortly before his death, according to the Historia Augusta, Hadrian composed a short poem in Latin addressed not to any person but to his own soul. Anumula, vagula, blondula, little wandering, charming soul, hospes, comesque, corporis, guest and companion of my body, asking where it would now go, to pale, stiff, and naked places, and warning with the kind of dry, characteristically wry humor that several ancient sources suggest had defined his personality throughout his life, that it would not, where it was going, be telling its usual jokes anymore. The poem, just 5 lines and 19 words in its original Latin, has been translated into English more times than almost any other piece of classical verse by poets across more than 3 centuries, each finding in its compressed, deceptively simple Latin something different to draw out a meditation on mortality, a final flash of the same restless, questioning intellectual curiosity that had defined Hadrian's engagement with philosophy and poetry across his entire adult life, or simply, as more skeptical modern scholars have sometimes suggested, the kind of memorable, quotable final words that ancient biographers loved attributing to powerful men, regardless of whether the dying man had actually composed them in his genuinely final moments. Whether or not Hadrian truly spoke or wrote these exact words as he lay dying, the poem has outlived nearly everything else he built, quoted, translated, and set to music continuously for the better part of 2,000 years. A final, oddly intimate footnote attached to a reign otherwise remembered chiefly for stone walls, domes, and the considerably less poetic business of deciding who would inherit an empire. Hadrian died, by most ancient accounts, a genuinely unpopular man as far as the Senate was concerned. The institution he had alienated in the opening weeks of his reign with 4 unexplained executions had never fully forgiven him, and his own deification, the formal process by which a dead emperor was declared a god, an honor essentially automatic for a ruler who had governed as long and as effectively as Hadrian had, was, remarkably, initially blocked by the very senators whose cooperation the process required. It took the direct, personal intervention of Hadrian's own chosen successor, pressuring and persuading the Senate to grant the deification despite its evident reluctance, that finally secured the honor. An intervention so consequential to Hadrian's own posthumous reputation that Antoninus himself earned as a direct result. The additional title Pius, the dutiful one, a name history would remember him by for the rest of recorded time, specifically because he had insisted on properly honoring an emperor whom Rome's own political establishment had, by the end, genuinely wanted to simply let go. Hadrian was buried, initially near Baiae, on an estate that had once, centuries earlier, belonged to Cicero, before his remains were eventually transferred, after Antoninus completed the construction of an enormous mausoleum across the Tiber in Rome, designed deliberately to evoke the much earlier mausoleum Augustus had built for himself and his own. family more than a century before. The structure, vastly altered and fortified across the subsequent centuries into what is now known as the Castel still stands today. One of the most recognizable landmarks in modern Rome, having served over the long arc of its 1900-year history as a papal fortress, a prison, and eventually a museum. A building whose original purpose, housing the remains of an emperor and his family, has been almost entirely obscured by everything it was subsequently repurposed to become. In exactly the same way that so much of Hadrian's own complicated legacy would eventually be obscured by the considerably simpler, considerably more flattering version of his life that popular memory chose. Over the centuries that followed, to actually remember, it is worth pausing before the final closing reflection on the considerably less dramatic but genuinely consequential administrative work Hadrian accomplished across his 21 years in power. Because, exactly as with Augustus and Constantine before him in this channel's coverage, the quiet machinery of actual governance often outlasts the more memorable individual episodes of any given reign. Hadrian commissioned a systematic codification of the Praetor's Edict, the accumulated body of Roman legal precedent and procedural rulings that had built up in increasingly disorganized form over centuries of individual praetors issuing their own annual judgments. The resulting compilation, known as the Perpetual Edict, organized and stabilized this body of law into a single, fixed reference text, a foundational achievement in the history of Roman Lebon's jurisprudence. He also expanded and formalized the role of the equestrian class, Rome's wealthy but non-senatorial citizens, within the actual administrative apparatus of the empire, increasingly staffing key bureaucratic and financial positions with career equestrian officials, rather than relying as heavily as previous emperors had on the senatorial aristocracy or on the personal freedmen and slaves, a shift that professionalized Roman administration in ways that reduced its dependence on the specific, sometimes openly hostile cooperation of a senatorial class that, as this narration has already demonstrated repeatedly, Hadrian could never fully count on. These reforms rarely appear in popular retellings of Hadrian's life. They generated no dramatic confrontations, no memorable quotations, no statues, but they represent, in the long arc of Roman administrative history, a genuine and lasting contribution to exactly the kind of stable, professionalized governance that allowed the empire to function smoothly through the equally celebrated and considerably calmer reigns of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius that followed his own. It is worth, before closing, placing Hadrian within the same long arc this channel has now traced across 3 previous emperors, because his reign occupies a genuinely distinct position within that arc, a deliberate pause, a conscious turning inward, sitting between Augustus's careful construction of an empire built on continued conquest and Constantine's eventual redirection of that same empire's deepest religious loyalties 2 centuries later. Augustus had built his entire reign on the patient management of appearance. The republic preserved in form while its substance quietly disappeared. Constantine, 2 centuries after Hadrian, would redirect the empire's religious identity with a single battlefield story whose precise truth mattered considerably less than its usefulness. And Hadrian, standing roughly at the midpoint between these 2 men, made a choice that neither of his fellow subjects of this channel's previous episodes ever seriously considered. He chose to stop, not stop ruling, not stop building, but stop the specific, centuries-old Roman assumption that the empire's fundamental purpose was continued outward expansion. This is, in its own quiet way, just as significant a break with tradition as anything Augustus or Constantine accomplished, and it deserves to be recognized as such. An empire that had defined itself, since its earliest mythic origins, through the language of conquest, expansion, and the absorption of ever more territory and ever more peoples, was told by the man who inherited it from the famously expansionist Trajan, that its actual task now lay in consolidation, in walls and fortifications and careful administration, rather than in continued advance. Hadrian's wall in Britain and his withdrawal from Trajan's eastern conquests are, in this sense, the same decision expressed twice, at opposite ends of the empire, a deliberate, permanent statement that Rome's destiny had changed shape. It did not make him popular. The same pattern that runs through Caesar's assassination and Augustus's careful theater and Constantine's contested vision runs through Hadrian's reign as well. The gap between what a ruler actually believes serves the long-term interests of the state and what his own immediate political class is prepared to forgive him for. The Senate never forgave the 4 executed consuls, never fully embraced his Hellenism, never warmed to a man who spent 12 of his 21 years away from the city they governed alongside him, and resisted, even after his death, the basic honor of declaring him a god, an honor that had to be extracted from them rather than offered. And yet, what Hadrian actually built, the wall that still draws hundreds of thousands of visitors to walk along its remaining stretches every year, the dome that still stands, essentially unaltered, in the middle of modern Rome, the succession arrangement that secured, against genuinely difficult odds, to further decades of stable, celebrated imperial governance after his own death, has outlasted the Senate's resentment by the better part of 2,000 years. In exactly the same way Caesar's calendar and Augustus's careful theater and Constantine's church councils outlasted the specific political resentments of their own immediate contemporaries. There is a thread running through all 4 of these men that is worth naming directly. As this series comes to its current resting point, each of them, Caesar, Augustus, Constantine, Hadrian, understood, in his own specific way, that the actual exercise of supreme power was never simply a matter of holding the largest army or commanding the most loyal soldiers. It was a matter of correctly diagnosing what the empire actually needed at the exact moment history handed it to them. Caesar diagnosed a republic that could no longer function and reached too visibly for what came next. Augustus diagnosed the specific danger in being seen to reach at all, and built his entire reign around appearing not to. Constantine diagnosed a population exhausted by civil war and gave it a single, unifying story large enough to outlast the empire that first told it. And Hadrian, inheriting a state that had spent 5 centuries defining itself through expansion, diagnosed correctly that the empire's actual survival now depended on learning, for the first time in its history, how to stop, that is, in the end. A considerably harder and considerably less glamorous form of statesmanship than conquest. And it is worth remembering the next time anyone walks along a remaining stretch of stone in northern England, or stands beneath a perfect circle of open sky in the middle of Rome, that both were built by the same restless, grieving, occasionally ruthless man who looked at an empire built entirely on the idea of always moving forward, and decided, with a confidence that cost him the Senate's lasting affection but secured his own genuinely permanent place in the physical landscape of two different continents, that the wiser course was to draw a line and hold it. The physical world Hadrian actually built has fared across 19 centuries, with a durability that even his own contemporaries could not have fully anticipated. Long stretches of the wall itself remain visible today across the width of northern England, walked by hundreds of thousands of visitors every year along a designated national trail that follows its entire original course, and recognized since 1987 as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a formal acknowledgement of exactly the kind of permanent, civilization-defining value that Hadrian's own contemporaries in the Roman Senate were genuinely reluctant to grant him. The Pantheon, remarkably, has never stopped being used continuously since its completion. Consecrated as a Christian church in the early 7th century, a conversion that, by sheer historical accident, may be the single reason it survived intact while so many other pagan temples across the empire were stripped, abandoned, or quarried for their stone. It still functions as a church today, housing, among other tombs, the remains of the Renaissance painter Raphael, and remains in its structural fundamentals exactly the building Hadrian's engineers completed in the 120s, the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth for well over 1,000 years after its construction, and still, even now, the standard against which architects measure the engineering ambition of their own domed structures. His villa at Tivoli, abandoned and stripped of much of its original statuary across the medieval and Renaissance centuries that followed, its marble repurposed into later cardinals' own competing villas just a short distance away, survives today as one of the most extensively excavated and most visited archaeological sites in all of Italy, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in its own right, where visitors can still walk through the foundations of the rooms Hadrian designed specifically to recreate, in miniature, the empire he had spent over a decade physically crossing in person, the ailing emperor's final melancholy act of architectural autobiography, still standing, still walkable, long after the body that once wandered through both the real empire and its miniature recreation finally, at Baiae, stopped wandering at all. Carry that with you. The wall still stands where he drew it, and somewhere along its quiet, weathered length, he is still here too. It is worth closing with one final observation about how unevenly history actually distributes its own memory, because Hadrian's reputation today rests overwhelmingly on the wall, the dome, and the deathbed poem, three genuinely remarkable achievements. While the 580,000 dead of the Bar Kokhba revolt occupy a far smaller place in popular Western memory than their actual scale would seem to demand, this is not a coincidence of historical accident. It reflects something true about who tends to write the history that survives, and whose grief tends to be preserved in stone monuments funded by the very state responsible for causing it, and whose grief, by contrast, survives mainly in religious liturgy, oral tradition, and texts produced by a community the empire had spent considerable effort trying to erase entirely from its own conquered capital. The wall still stands because Rome built it to stand. The Pantheon still stands because a later Christian institution found it useful enough to consecrate and maintain. But the absence of Jewish life in Aelia Capitolina for the better part of 2 centuries, the banned Sabbath, the executed rabbis, the renamed province whose name still echoes through global politics 1900 years later. These are losses, not monuments, and losses simply do not get the same kind of careful architectural preservation that triumphant building projects receive. This is, in its own way, the single most important lesson this entire 4-part series on Roman emperors has tried to demonstrate: that the version of history which survives most visibly is rarely a neutral record of what actually happened. It is a record shaped consistently by who had the resources and the motivation to build something permanent, and who was instead left only with grief, memory, and the considerably more fragile work of simply continuing to exist. If tonight's account of Hadrian, or of Caesar, or of Augustus, or of Constantine before him, has changed how you think about any of these men, the marble busts replaced, even slightly, by the considerably stranger and more complicated human beings who actually lived these lives, then this channel has done exactly what it sets out to do every single time. If you found this useful, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing the kind of long-form, carefully researched history that does not simplify its subjects into easy heroes or easy villains. And if there is a specific emperor, empress, or episode from this same sprawling 400-year arc of Roman history you would like to see covered next in this same depth, leave it in the comments below. The research for these episodes is shaped directly by what you ask for. A thumbs up costs nothing and tells the algorithm that long, patient, properly sourced history like this is worth showing to more people who might fall asleep to it tonight, exactly the way you may be doing right now. Thank you for spending these hours with Hadrian, with his wall, his grief, his architecture, and his considerably more complicated legacy than any single sentence could ever fully capture. Sleep well, and we will see you in the next one.